So, the Lord be with you.
And also with the
Let us
Spirit.
pray.
Sorry.
I'm trying to think of how I can extempore a prayer and write one. Forsooth, thou art thou God. Lord, you gathered us together to learn of the quiet witnesses to the faith and the small ways in which they have affected great change in our lives and the life of the proclamation of the gospel. So be with us now as we gather together this evening to be illuminated as to these somewhat unknown people, but also to evoke within us that small witness that we make present every day, so that our story may join that of those perhaps unknown, but nevertheless who have made a difference in their world and with those whom they love. And all this we do for the sake of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Last week, I couldn't fit his whole name in. Last week, Samuel Isaac Joseph Shereshevsky, who had to go undercover as Samuel Isaac Joseph because he didn't want people in the mid-19th century to know he was a Jew until he met the Hebrew professor from the General Theological Seminary. And as we've mentioned before, what is the best seminary in the history of this country? Right. And still miraculously in business. Anyway, Shereshevsky became eventually the bishop, I don't know what happened to that lost quotation, the bishop of Shanghai. Now, it sounds significant for somebody to be a bishop, but a lot of times in the history of the Episcopal Church, people have been made bishop because they have one particular talent or ability that marks them as radically different from any other potential candidate. I always think about the first bishop of Alaska, when Alaska became a state in 1959, yeah. The 49th state in 1959, Alaska was made into the Diocese of Alaska, and they didn't have anybody who was qualified to be bishop because they were looking for one particular talent, one particular ability, and they finally found it with a guy, and they were going to make him bishop, but they realized, to their surprise, he was too young, according to the canons, to be a bishop. So he was made archdeacon of Alaska until he was finally old enough to be consecrated a bishop. What do you think his talent was? Anybody want to guess? Dog sledding?
Dog sledding?
Yeah, that would be the first one. Yeah, he was a pilot. He was a pilot.
Oh, pilot. Yeah.
And he was actually able to fly himself, to the far ranges. He just couldn't be the bishop until such a time. Shereshevsky was the first Episcopalian to be fluent in Mandarin, and thus ideal to become bishop of Shanghai, which was the Orient, that and the Bishop of Shanghai. John Watanabe, the first Japanese presiding bishop or primate or archbishop, actually to be fluent in English, come to think of it. Pretty good English. Anyway, we remember him, right? The former kamikaze pilot trainee who helped clean up after Hiroshima, saw the great witness of the Christian monks and was wonderfully inspired, so much so that he joins a rather lofty rank of really significant bishops and archbishops in our tradition. Alan Watts.
Nuts.
Mostly, yeah. Defranked Episcopal priest, but nevertheless, virtually everything that has been explored about Eastern spirituality and Christian Buddhist relations and things like that, the foundation, as crooked as it could be, was built by Watts. His books, most of his books are still in print. And then Matty Musa, who opened up the Middle East to us and did so in a way that was particular to his personality and talents. I always remember my mother one time saying, "Oh, somebody called you. His name was Marty Moose?" Yes, she did, your grandmother. All right, tonight, let's see if it's on. Here we go. Tonight, we look at the wounded healers. Archibald McIndoe. Anybody ever hear of him? Oh man, he is by far. I wanted to start with him because what he did was remarkable. Rel Sun, that's okay. John Fitch, might ring a bell. Yeah, might ring a bell.
No.
And James Magner, which would ring no bells whatsoever. A couple of Pulitzers, but no bells. No bells. All right, we'll start with Archie McIndoe. Dr. Archibald McIndoe of New Zealand. A member of the Church of New Zealand, a member of the Anglican Communion. Born in 1900, died of overwork and with a heart attack. at the age of 60. You notice that's sort of a leitmotif of
Yeah.
how these people exist. His motto of his foundation was per agio ad astra, through adversity to the stars. I want you to look at that face for a minute. That is a kind man. That is a kind face. His specialty, and he was one of the very first, and probably the very best, his specialty was reconstructive surgery. And so when he graduated from med school in the 1930s, starting in New Zealand, and then going across to Australia, and then coming to the attention of the, well, it was still part of the empire in those days, to the greater powers that be in England, Macindoe developed several interesting things. One of the things he did was, well, here is a world-recognized reconstructive surgeon. Anyway, he was employed by the Mayo Clinic. At the outbreak of World War II, he was directed by the Crown to head the Empire's address of the severely maimed. He'd already pioneered a variety of reconstructive techniques, especially the Macindoe nose. If you have lost your nose in 2020, it will be reconstructed through his process. You will receive a Macindoe nose. That's how good it was. So that was something. Anyway, during the war, now you imagine World War II, let me just, and I may have mentioned this once in a sermon, just because it was really startling to me. The thing that always got me about World War II and Korean veterans in the United States was they never talked about it. They may have been there, but they never talked about it. I always thought my dad was kind of interesting in that regard. He never talked about it. He was a sergeant in the Army during the Korean War, never talked about it, and then when he died, I found a bunch of stuff that indicated that he had a rather remarkable career in the Army. But okay. My uncle, who was in the Marine Corps during the Korean War, was a hero, and he never mentioned it. They came back, they got married, they had kids, they had jobs, both of them, that they kept, for the same job pretty much for the rest of their lives. They had homes in the suburb, and they had barbecues in the backyard, and they had all that stuff. They returned to a certain normalcy. When I was at school in Scotland, I saw the same thing. They didn't talk about it. This was among my teachers and some of my mother's cousins. They did not speak of it, but you saw the trauma of war with them differently. I had a teacher who was missing an arm. I had a teacher who was missing an eye. He looked like a pirate. It was wonderful. I had the rugby instructor had been shot in the head. And he never talked about it, but you could tell because there was a channel blown through the side of his skull and through his ear that looked like the perfect outline tracing of a .30 caliber bullet.
That's hockey for you.
What's that?
That's rugby for you. I
got the his ears were probably.
I got the
They would have
sports
got
mixed
worse.
up.
Yeah.
Hockey would do the same thing, though.
Yeah. So that. My cousin, my mother's cousin Bill, some distant cousin of mine, I don't know, it was with him that I would stay. He would always, even on those really brutally hot summer days in Scotland, when the temperature creeped up to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, he always wore long sleeve shirts, and I just thought that was his affectation. He played tennis in long sleeve shirts. And then we were doing something, I can't remember what, changing a flat tire on his car, and he rolled up his sleeves, and his flesh had been burned off his forearms, which I didn't realize. And his wife saw me notice. I was 15, you noticed, and you don't always cover it up well, And all she said to me was, Bill is in the Royal Navy. That explained everything. So there's that whole named generation. And I saw more men of that age group all around it, riding the buses in Edinburgh, taking the train down south, all of that, who were missing bits and pieces of themselves, and some clearly had had their faces reconstructed. Well, Macindoe developed, he was given all the money that England had for this, so much so that he was able to choose where in England his hospital would be built. His clinic really in those days would be built. And he made an unusual choice because he had developed a radical treatment for wounded soldiers, the most radical ever devised. He discovered that if you treated them like they were normal people, instead of the maimed, the destroyed, or the disfigured, they healed faster. And psychologically, they healed. That's what happened. And so, originally, he would tell them they didn't have to wear hospital gowns when they were in the hospital. They could wear their uniforms. And those uniforms, of course, with ranks, with ribbons, with all those things, was their sense of identity. That made a difference. He, and this was, if it had been anyone else, he would have gotten in trouble. He opened a pub on the hospital grounds where they were to gather at the end of the day and sing songs and whatnot and have a drink or two, you know. In other words, behave normally as they would before the war when they were back home. Now, I'm going to have to make another aside here because this was early in my ministry. Nice young man had went into his tool shed. He had you didn't realize he had a leaky gas can in there, and the shed was filled with fumes, and he had a lit cigarette in his mouth. And so when he opened the door of the shed and went in there, according to the neighbors, it was the quietest explosion you didn't really hear. But essentially, he melted his flesh off. And so when I went to the hospital to see him, and this was the first really, I was 29, this is the first dramatically injured person I'd seen. He was washing the dead flesh off his arms because they encourage people to wash their own dead flesh off. And he wasn't worried about anything except he was afraid his little daughter, who at the time was not even 2, would be horrified by him, and that his wife wouldn't love him anymore. And the little girl came in, boy, get choked. The little girl came in and hugged her daddy as much as she could. He was loved, and his healing accelerated. Mackendorf sees this over and over again. If you treat them like they're normal, if you don't separate them from society, they're going to heal, and their psychology, their psychological balance is going to be better. So he moved the clinic to this town of East Grimstead in Sussex, which is, boy, I'll tell you, Grimstead.
Yeah.
Anyway, East Grimstead in Sussex, which is in the middle of nowhere, and created the Guinea Pig Club, which was designed as a mutual aid society for those maimed and disfigured in the war. In other words, it was an early form of group therapy before it was called that. It was, for all intents and purposes, a drinking and social club, nothing more and nothing less. However, through the club and the hospital, he used his considerable charm and massive reputation to engage the citizens of the local community in the healing process. He insisted that the guinea pigs, and that is a proper noun because that's how they identified themselves, rather proudly, we are the guinea pigs, leave the hospital during the day and go into the world. Even if the world simply meant to the village of East Grinstead, he sent them out to local shops, groceries, and pubs. He sent them out to walk around. And everybody got used to him. And then however disfigured, or however, in the process of being reconstructed, however many faces were half blown away or getting put back together again, they were in uniform, they were walking around, and after a short time, the people didn't stare at them anymore. They were treated normally, and the healing was fabulous. It was amazing. And then, of course, McIndoe, again, look at that face. By now, I think Sir Archibald McIndoe was innovating all sorts of new ways of reconstruction. So, one thing, they were at the cutting edge of that. They were getting the best treatment they got anywhere in the world, and they had the best psychological support. He did this because, well, guess what? It was part of his devotion as a proper Anglican. This was the thing he understood that God called him to do, this in particular. So he created that clinic, and he never left. The war would end, he would still deal with some of the guys. Korean War would come along, he'd have another brace of patients. The Malayan emergency would come along, he'd have more patients. He'd have people from automobile accidents, from fires, from Lord knows what else. IRA bombs, maybe, I don't know, I guess not by 1960, all sorts of things. But the thing he gave them that was fantastic was he allowed them to regain their sense of humor. No longer stigmatized by their wounds. The young soldiers, sailors, airmen, etc. were able to live normally and heal greatly. Some of them even wound up marrying local women. That's when you know your experiment is successful, I think. All of them received perhaps the greatest gift, however. This is their song.
Are you going to sing it?
Yeah, we're all going to sing it because it's to the tune of The Church is One Foundation.
Oh.
We are McIndoe's army, we are his guinea pigs. With dermatums and petticoats, glass eyes, false teeth, and wigs. And when we get our discharge, we'll shout with all our might. Per ardua ad astra, we'd rather drink than fight. It's an amazing story.
You were good.
Yeah, you sound fabulous. I expect that. Even Amanda was funky. Good job. Good job. All right. Anyway, they called him the boss. They called him the maestro. He called it his boys, and that certainly was their relationship. He became a loving figure of these men. A whole generation of wounded and their medicos, I use the English term, learned of and benefited from his true sense of healing. And after the war, the Guinea Pig Club continued to meet annually until this century, when I think there's 3 left. All right, out of them all. This was just a few years ago, and here's some of the remaining fellows. Look at how they lived into old age. Do they not look happy? Do they not look normal? Do they not look like good old-fashioned English grandpas and great-grandfathers? And there they are gathered around the statue in East Grinstead that's dedicated to McIndoe, which has him standing behind a soldier. I think it's actually an airman with his hands on his shoulders, just sort of saying, yeah, we'll be all right. He's wearing his surgical gear. You see his mask pulled down in front of him. Nowadays, he'd have to wear it. So there we have it. Archibald McIndoe, who we've never heard of, right?
Right.
Anyone you know who's had reconstructive surgery has directly benefited because of what he did. And any kind of treatment we have for anybody who's been through any kind of physical trauma, which is designed to, I don't know what to re-normalize them, owes it not to Freud and Jung and all the others, but actually owes it to Dr. McIndoe. Nice story. Good. He should really have a feast day on our calendar. Thanks.
Yes,
We will now. Rel Hitter, son. Kapolioka Guy. Son, 1950 to 1998. Her middle name, which I've never been able to pronounce, means, you ready? Heart of the Sea.
Hawaiian.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Real Hawaiian. Rel's son grew up in Makaha, which is a poor township, well, in 1950 on the outskirts of Honolulu. It's impoverished. She grew up in a Quonset hut with a number of brothers and sisters. Her dad earned a living as one of the famous, although not well paid, Waikiki Beach Boys. You ever hear of them? The Waikiki Beach Boys. As far as I know, only one ever gained any kind of economic satisfaction, and his name was Duke Kahanamoku.
Oh,
You know Duke, right? Yeah.
I thought you were gonna say Don Ho. I did too.
Tiny bubbles.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow. Still a lot of Hawaiian prejudice around here. Duke Kahanamoku is the father of surfing. He also created life-saving, the life-saving, whatever it is, Corps, the life-saving, what's it called in Southern California?
Coast Guard?
Team?
No, the lifesavers, Baywatch.
Lifeguard.
That
Oh,
stuff.
Baywatch.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
but which is really organized and has a massive budget. If you ever see anyone at a lifeguard station using, instead of a boat or a raft or a float or something like that, a surfboard, that's because of what Kahanamoku brought. I bring him up only because she became his protege, because he knew her dad, because Kahanamoku was one of the Waikiki Beach Boys. In the 1920s, when there was only one hotel on Waikiki Beach, and Hollywood people would go there, and wealthy people would go there, the Beach Boys would show up. They'd teach people how to surf. They'd teach people how to swim, because not everybody knew how to do that back then. They would give tours of Oahu. They would do anything, really, to earn a living, and her dad did that. Which meant, of course, that he was surfing every day, which you could do in Hawaii, some of them even during hurricanes. And it meant that his kids grew up surfing every day. So Rel's son started surfing when she was 4 years old. And as far as anyone can remember, except for a rather drastic time in her life, she surfed every day. From the day she was born to the day she died, which unfortunately was at the age of actually 47. She died before her 40th birthday. Okay, so Relson is a completely ordinary, gifted athlete. Whee! Although nowadays she's known as the Queen of Macabre. She's the daughter of a wife to keep each boy who was serving for. In 1966, she competed in the first and now legendary World Surfing Competition. There was no separation between men and women surfers then, because there were 3 women surfers. And so she competed with the guys and finished in the top 10. Her style was remarkable. In 1968, just 2 years later, she decided to start a separate women's tour so that she could encourage more women to come and join in surfing. And also, what's the thing that, what really changed between 1966 and, say, the year 2020 in surfing? Back then, you couldn't make a living as a surfer, even if you were the best one in the world. Nowadays, whoa, make a great living, make a fantastic living. There's 18-year-olds who are millionaires because they can surf, and because Quicksilver or Billabong or one of those businesses has given them a sponsorship. Anyway, and she made that possible for women. She was a classic waterman. You know the term? You know what it means? She could surf, she could sail, she could fish, she could swim, she could dive, she could scuba dive, she could free dive. That's scary. Free diving, familiar with that?
Flips?
Oh, no, she couldn't cliff dive, I don't think. Maybe she could. Free diving is when you hold your breath and you go down. I'm not sure what the world record is. I think it's 300 feet, something. 300 feet. Yeah. Those of you, anybody gone scuba diving? Okay. You can, on the way up, you can exhale the whole way up and thus prevent yourself from getting bends. So really you just have to go all the way down, holding your breath the entire time. It requires you to go into almost a trance. Honestly, thinking about it gives you claustrophobia. I can't imagine, because I just picture, okay, I'm 300 feet down, and now I'm starting to panic because I can't breathe. It's instant death. All right. She was all those things. And again, talented athlete, real inspiration to young women. The guys loved her because she was nice looking, but also because her technique was fantastic. It was almost like a ballerina on a board. And then something happened. And remember, this Thursday we're talking about the wounded healers, right? No, the heart of the sea. She was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was 31 years old, particularly aggressive form. She was given 1 year to live. And that's where her story moves from that of a talented athlete to one of a committed social activist. She was really getting to be something in the surfing world. She had pushed it so that she was actually getting sponsorships. She had a daily radio show where she talked surfing and something else that's kind of interesting, Hawaiian identity. The Hawaiian identity had been somewhat suppressed. This was a culture of kings and queens. This was a culture that knew how to navigate in the South Pacific by using the senses. Are you familiar with that kind of navigation? The navigation technique had to be sort of rediscovered. Well, obviously, you tell which way the wind's blowing, right? You feel the humidity in your own being, your own body, and you see changes that way. You stick your hand in the water and you test the temperature. This is how they would navigate in ancient days on those outriggers from vast distances between the islands with near perfection. As good as anybody with a GPS or a sextant or something like that. But that had been lost. And Hawaiian culture became really dominated by poverty, obesity, disease, alcoholism, and drugs. And since she grew up in a Quonset hut, in a place that even to this day, locals will tell you, don't be in Makaha after dark. She brought all that back to her community. Schools, foundations, ways for kids, reading programs, also, you name it, she brought it back to her community. Absolutely committed to it. And in particular, teaching kids that if you go surfing, and even if you're not good at it, you're going to find some sort of spiritual balance. She was invited, when a teenager, to attend for free the Episcopal School in Honolulu. A school that's, significant people have attended, like Duke Kahanamoku. And of course, the famous Buster Crabbe. You know Buster, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Tarzan. Tarzan in one movie, yeah. Anyway, what did somebody said on one time? Somebody asked one of the crew how Buster Crabbe was as Tarzan, and the crew member said, as compared to Johnny Weissmuller, because they were two competing studios, the crew member said, well, from the neck down, he's about the same. From the neck up, he's a real improvement. But of course, he had an Episcopal education. So anyway, so that's what started to happen. Let's see. She encouraged young women to compete in sport and expect to receive generous sponsorships. I should say, we talk about income inequities in surfing for at least 20 years now. Men and women earn the same. Interesting sort of, equality there. Okay, she would not live 1 year, however. She would live 15. She would keep at it. She'd keep doing it. She would carry on every day until the final one. And as she said, near the end of her life, it was all about the aloha spirit. You give, and you give from the heart until you have nothing else to give. She went to a little non-denominational chapel. She was taught to read by Episcopal nuns. She had a chance to be a fully scholarship student at the premier Episcopal high school in Hawaii, but instead she went to surfing because she was better at it, she said, than she was at sitting in school, and also she was earning money that she could give to her family. Because her father could no longer be a Waikiki beach boy, and her mother could only bring in so much water. So, nice story. And that was Rel Sun. So anytime you see a woman surfing in a competition, well, it might be the Rel Sun surfing competition, or she might be surfing for the Rel Sun trophy, or she might be any of those things. It's because of her. Also, look at that stop. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There we go.
James Bond.
A Connecticut Episcopalian, folks. John Fitch. Some of you may recognize the background. The rolling hills of Lakeville. That's right. That's Lime Rock. That's early Lime Rock. Just look at how narrow the track is. Yeah. And it almost looks a little gravelly, but I think that's probably what's known as clack, which is the stuff that rolls off the tires when the cars go at 150 miles an hour. John Fitch was 1917 to 2012. John Fitch, one day, I've got to tell you what happened. One day, I'm talking to his son, because his son was one of my parishioners. And John went to St. John Salisbury. He was buried at St. John Salisbury. Anyway, I said to his son, does your dad still have that car he built himself, that famous Fitch Special? And he rolled his eyes and he said, oh yeah. Yeah, we're trying to get him to stop driving it. He was at the time about 90 years old. And next thing I knew, John Fitch asked me if I wanted to go for a short ride in the car. I'm still alive. It's amazing being in a car with an 89-year-old who's driving 95. You ever been to West Cornwall, the covered bridge?
Yeah.
Yeah, we went through that thing so fast, I can't even tell you. Oh my goodness, that car was beautiful. And I was remembering something that I read about Richard Petty one time, Bob, well, you've probably heard of this. They wired up Richard Petty once to see what his heart rate and respiration and everything would be when he's sitting behind the wheel, hold number 43, and I can't remember whether it was during his Plymouth years or his Ford years, but anyway, they wanted to see what the human body did when it's driving 200 miles an hour. And his blood pressure and his respiration went down. He was like a guy in a recliner watching a football game. Just it went up when he stopped, but when he was down, he was cool. He was super cool. Graham Hill once said he found himself not always remembering the race. Graham Hill was a world champion in Formula One racing. He couldn't really remember winning the race, but he knew he had raced because his fingernails had grown over a 2-hour period, significantly. It was like Wolfman. All right, so I'm riding along with John Fitch, and he's cool as a cucumber, and I'm, screaming. I told him because, oh, hey, watch out for the, okay, never mind. All right. Hey, this curb, John, this curb, okay, right, all right, we're good. Just zipping along. Oh, one of the best times I ever had. He drove, we probably just did like a 15, 20 mile move, so I was in that car for 6 minutes. Well, here's the interesting thing about John. He was undeniably a devout Episcopalian. And he had something that happened, again, we're talking about wounded healers here. He had something that happened to him, not directly, but he was part of something that altered automobile racing pretty significantly, especially European racing. but also made him realize auto racing in the 1950s didn't have to be the way it was. Now, one of the things was he raced for Mercedes-Benz, and one of his co-drivers was Sterling Moss. Does that ring a bell? He was probably the world's greatest driver. Second greatest driver. He was in a terrible accident, couldn't race again. They were never specific about his injuries. I would see him at Lime Rock every once in a while. He'd come, he looked entirely normal, but I always wondered if it was psychological, because people didn't talk about things like that. His other racing partner was a guy named Juan Fangio. No, huh? Okay, the Babe Ruth of Formula One racing. All right, so here's Fitch. And then, let's see. Well, let's point some things. You know what makes a racer different from other people? This is at 90 miles an hour. Faster it goes, the more relaxed he becomes, which is why I was never a racer. So we're zipping along. Born, believe it or not, in Indianapolis, Indiana, where else, to an executive with the Stutz Automotive Company. With the Bearcat, and I can't name any other Stutz. Hung around with the engineers, the mechanics, the fabricators, and all those of the car world, all the gearheads. Learned cars inside out, began racing after returning home from World War II. By the way, in World War II, he was a Mustang pilot, P-51, the best fighter, single-seat fighter of the Second World War. So good that in air racing, you still see P-51s being used. A World War II era propeller-driven plane. Anyway, so comes home like the speed, He was one of the first Americans to compete successfully in European auto racing, road racing. He was Sports Car Driver of the Year in 1953. He was considered the fourth greatest driver in the world when he decided to compete in the Le Mans 24-hour race. We do know that race, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right. By the way, if you see a movie called Ford versus Ferrari, starring the guy who played Batman and Matt Damon, who's the Batman guy? Christian Bale. There we go. It's worth seeing because you get a nice and very entertaining window into this world and its ethos and its perspectives. And anyway, so we go to the 1955 Le Mans 24-hour race, and they're buzzing around the track, and he's on a three-man team with a German guy. Actually, I think he was Austrian, named Karl Kling, or was it Klaus, his brother? Maybe it was Klaus Kling. It's one of the famous Kling brothers. You've all heard of them.
Klaus Kling, I can't even say that.
No, neither can they. So, and a guy named Pierre Levay, who was probably too old to be racing at Le Mans, and was complaining he couldn't control the car and was getting dizzy in the corners. Great. And John Fitch. And it was Fitch's turn to drive, because you have two or three drivers in a car. One driver drives for 3-4 hours, and then they switch, but the car keeps going. And the car whizzes by the pits. The guy was supposed to stop, and Fitch wasn't quite sure what was up. Mrs. Fitch, back home in Connecticut, gets a call from the Voice of America. Mrs. Fitch, do you have any reaction to the death of your husband? I knew Mrs. Fitch. She was surprised. She liked to talk about this, especially after her second gin. So, and she didn't know about that. Well, Fitch didn't die. LeVay, on that lap, Fitch was supposed to be in the car. Well, nobody's quite sure what happened. You want to see it though? Let's see part of it anyway. That's what happened. Yeah. It's hard to describe. The car, and it was an early experiment in magnesium alloy. It was a Mercedes-Benz. And you know how magnesium burns?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here.
There's sparkles there.
Let's look at a British newsreel, shall we? This is only 2
When the
minutes.
greatest sports car event of the year, the Le Mans 24-hour race opens in brilliant sunshine, none of the quarter-million crowd suspect the tragedy that lies ahead. The 60 starters are in their stride, thundering away to gain that early lead, which can mean so much in a mass-start race such as this. Favorites among the big machines are the Mercedes team, led by Fangio, with Sterling Moss, Karl Kling, and Pierre Levay. But the fans' eyes are also on Mike Hawthorne, Tony Roach, and the other Jaguar drivers. Fangio's Mercedes is well away, and the smaller machines are battling for supremacy in their own categories. The leaders streak past the grandstand after the early laps with Mercedes, Jaguars, and Ferraris well to the fore. Into the pit comes Rich Parnell's Lagonda while the field roars on. Peter Collins' Aston Martin, number 23, is among the British cars which are holding their own. Now Parnell Mercedes collides and blows up.
Worst audio disaster.
Death wipes out whole families. LeVay is killed before his wife's eyes, and some 70 spectators with him. Among the bodies, frantic survivors seek their friends. The Mercedes was made partly of magnesium alloy, which blazes like a furnace. Lance Macklin's Austin Healey, hit by the doomed car before it crashed, is wrecked, but miraculously Macklin is unhurt. While firemen fight the blaze, the race goes on. Most of the vast crowd know nothing of the tragedy. Track marshals flag down drivers as they pass the Holocaust. Doctors, priests, uninjured survivors do their best. But 79 men, women and children are dead or dying in the worst disaster in motor racing history. The Mercedes team with a strong chance of victory withdrew from the race, and Mike Hawthorne's Jaguar wins by 5 laps. So later the finishers are British cars. A fine achievement overshadowed by an appalling tragedy.
Mercedes-Benz would withdraw from automobile racing for 50 years. 50 years. Yeah, I mean, we always think of them as being a prominent automobile company, and certainly they are. They're probably the only European company that was able to be prominent without having to compete in European racing, but everybody understood why. I should say, since they came back in, what was that, 2005, they've been absolutely dominant in Formula One racing. They win every year, every year. It's very boring. I don't even watch the races anymore because I know that Mercedes-Benz is going to win. So, Fitch, a man of faith, a spiritual person, is profoundly troubled by this. Now, Bob, you go to races. Surely you go with Bob, right? Or maybe Shirley, you go to races. Bob, you go with Shirley. But, I mean, imagine a whole car flying into the crowd. And if you've got 70 dead, men and women and children, so 70 dead, imagine how many were severely and grievously injured. It was a terrific disaster. It was horrible. And Fitch starts looking at things a little differently because, again, you know, in trauma, we try to find some sort of answer. Why did this happen? Is there a purpose in this? Something like that. He started looking, he started thinking, why are there trees lining the racetrack? The Le Mans uses mostly, not completely, but mostly, even to this day, streets that are used by regular passenger cars during the week. But in those days, there would be potholes, there would be irregularities, there would be cracks, there would be things like that. So if anybody got into an accident, and again, these cars are getting faster and faster, and you notice there wasn't a whole lot of head covering in the car. The driver would often be killed. And in fact, that lasted up until the early 1970s. It was the highest mortality rate of any sport. Anyway, the driver would be killed. Members of the crowd would be at least injured or killed, all these things. And just, he thought, okay, why did this happen? And what can I do? There's 2 things he could do. He could scare the noise out of a big wine rock, which he did. But he would also create a company. Which would create the thing known as the Fitch barrier. We've all seen these, right?
Mm-hmm.
The yellow barrels?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With sand.
Yep. John Fitch's invention. That's not all. He invented some other things too. You notice this? We've probably seen this one. These? 1 or 2 times?
The garment? Yeah.
That particular style of guardrail. Yeah. Or armor coat or armalite or something like that. Guardrail. We just call them guardrails now. That's how ubiquitous they are. There's an early experiment with looks like a shelling station, slamming into some barrels. But yeah, he created these and many other things that originally were intended for racing, but obviously, as you can see, you know, these were meant for the access road to the pits. You know, here's the racetrack, here's the access road. Sometimes drivers get a little wiggly and hit the point and decapitate themselves. So he developed those, and we see them on the highways, and they've rescued many a person. The airbag cage, right, was from his drawing board. He didn't create it, but he had the original idea. We didn't have the size at that point, but now we do. And probably all destroy cars that have that or something similar. Alyssa's a 20-year-old pickup truck. All these things, again, a small weight, an exercise of faith, a trauma. You can imagine the sort of sense of guilt you would carry in yourself too, that you would have. That was almost him, although probably he would have not driven off the track. I think the day was just in bad shape. But it was his car, his team, the car that he had just driven that day. and 70 people were dead, and the memory of 70 extended families were disrupted. So, spent the rest of his life, which was long and happy. I think one of the best things I saw was when he was 90 years old. I was reading the local Salisbury paper and saw that local resident John Fitch was issued a speeding ticket. Oh, yeah, there we go. But anyway, so yeah, Blind Rock, he was very good. All right, everybody, one more. There he is. Really, you can't say anything more. You will have never heard of him. That's okay. I kind of included him because he's representative of a whole class of people that we sometimes miss historically. Because everything that he did was done by so many others as part of, again, we're almost going back to Mackinac, this kind of self-care for, well, veterans who had seen horrible things and sometimes been horribly wounded. All right, James Magner, gosh, he was many things. He was, well, let's talk about this instead. He was very representative of the post-World War II Korean War experience. And this is so tiny and hard to read. Here, the GI Bill enabled higher education, or a higher education, for those who would not have qualified previously. All right? The more mature freshmen changed the university system. You're at the University of North Carolina, and you're meeting with the first-year students, and it's a room full of men, as it turns out, and you explain to them that during this first year, they have to wear a beanie, the so-called freshman beanie. Now, once upon a time, fine, you're talking to a bunch of 17 and 18-year-olds who are all spiffed up in Brooks Brothers or something, you know, just looking just great, and with a Princeton collar, a tie that's probably a UNC tie. Yes, we'll wear the beanie. Except it's now 1946, and the guys you're explaining have to wear a beanie are guys who were in the 101st Airborne on D-Day. Right? They were like guys from the Band of Brothers, you know, fellows who were in the Army through the horror of World War II. And they just decide, no, they're not going to wear beanies, and if anyone tries to put a beanie on their head, they will address it in a very direct manner. Suddenly, education changed a little bit. And these weren't just sort of glorified high school kids, these were fully grown people. And they were claiming their own, very forthrightly, in this world. The GI Bill opened up the class structure in American education, much more so in English education, where they had something similar, but it changed everything. So those who would have been members of the working class were now able to make greater choices in vocation, and even some of them go into higher education as lecturers and professors and things like that. They were able to study in laboratories, which would have been denied them once before. They were able to gain the skills that would allow them to be creative in fields that were once upon a time blocked to those of the so-called lower economic class. And the arts during this period start to be entertained by new voices and perspectives from the former outsiders. A misplaced article, never mind, pretend you don't see that. Much of post-war literature was dominated by this newness, right? I want you to think about, you've heard of Jack Kerouac, right? Mm-hmm. All right, well, there's a classic example. Working class guy from Lowell, Massachusetts. Grew up in a home where they spoke French, because his parents were from Montreal or Quebec, somewhere there. Anyway, and would have been a pure working class fellow. And instead, he was served in the Merchant Marine during the Second World War. Instead, is granted, for a time anyway, an education at Columbia and access to a whole different world, as were those who were in his peer group. And they transformed American literature, or better or not, I don't know, that's somebody else, but anyway, they started to participate. Some whose trauma was damaging sought a more spiritual form of address. Christian and Buddhist monasteries, thank you, Alan Watts, in the United States enjoyed unprecedented growth. Remember Thomas Merton? We've spoken of him before, right? Okay. Merton's monastery down there in Kentucky was between 1945 and 1953 had to build 4 times the number of residences because all these young men sometimes not so young, then were joining the monastery. That's how they were self-treating their PTSD, because, which is there. All right, so, and in fact, a lot of the explosion of Christian participation, I mean, we look at churches like ours, like all of them, really, and, we watch them sort of doing this. A lot of what we grew up with was that post-war explosion of spirituality, where people were going to church just because, I mean, I think about it. I think about my parents' generation. We had depression, we had war, we had the atomic age, like that, one decade after the other. Where are you going to go? Oh, I'm going to church. Just going to church. Whatever. There's something there. There's community. There's somebody willing to address my questions. There's some sense of the greater, the eternal, all those things. And some hope. I remember growing up as a child that as long as there's a God, we're not going to blow ourselves up. But, anyway, in many cases, literature and spirituality interpenetrated, and dominated both the Word, as in the Word made flesh, and the words for the remainder of the century. So here's James Magner. Laborer, soldier, monk, student, poet, and teacher. Born in Brooklyn to a devout Roman Catholic family. Worked as a wage earner. He did a variety of things. And a freelance reporter, which believe me is about the closest thing to being a wage earner there is. Served in the army during the Korean War and was wounded. And according to him, was apparently involved in a number of circumstances where he had to kill people. I think probably a lot of people. I think he was probably good at it. And I think it probably scared him. You ever see Lawrence of Arabia? Mm-hmm. There's this glorious moment where Lawrence has to explain to General Allenby. Allenby doesn't know what's wrong with him. He's just had a successful mission. But see, one of the things that Lawrence had to do to keep tribal warfare from breaking out, because there's all these tribes he had unified to fight the Turk. And historically, the tribes can't stand one another. They're like the Hatfields and the McCoys. And one tribe's member had stolen from another tribe. And the tribe from whom he had stolen was demanding that he be executed. And the tribe from which the guy came was defending him. And Lawrence finally said, look, I don't belong to any tribe. I'll execute him. So Lawrence kills one of his own guys. Again, World War I, those things. It bothered him, and Allenby asked him what was wrong, and this is according to the Robert Bolt version anyway. He says to Allenby, there was something about it I didn't like. And Allenby says, well, naturally, nobody likes to kill. And he says, no, there was something else. And Allenby says, well, you'll manage it better next time. That is, manage the men better next time, so these circumstances don't happen again. And he says, no, there's something else. I liked it. I liked having that ultimate control. Poor Lawrence. Great archaeologist. Pretty good nutcase, too. Anyway, but you can sort of understand.
Ned, right?
Huh?
Ned.
Yeah. Lawrence Edward Lawrence, yeah. Who, was on the team, was the number 2 on the team that discovered Carchemish before the war. Anyway, Magner saw something. He never talked about it because he was of that generation. They don't talk about these things. But he went into the congregation of the Passion of Jesus Christ, and we know as the Passionist Fathers, right there in West Hartford, Connecticut. And was a member of that order for 5 years.
Is it still around?
Oh yeah, we have
Holy
our.
Cross? Is it Holy Cross?
Huh?
Is it Holy
No,
Cross?
it's the Passionist one. It's the one where we had a clergy day or a safe church. I can't
Or
remember.
the,
It's in West Hartford. It's kind of in the shadow of UConn Medical Center.
oh, yeah,
Yeah.
off on Farmington Avenue.
Yeah.
Off Farmington.
It's a big facility. Very nice. Got a great library. Got a pretty nice bookstore, too. Last minute religious gifts, best place to go. So,
For all our emergency.
yeah, well, you never know.
Right.
It happens to me sometimes. Oh, I better get something for. All right. Anyway, yeah. So that wasn't exactly his cup of tea, but the other monks, the other passionate monks, if you ever see them, they wear a black habit that has like a gold heart embroidered in the actual fabric of their habits. It's kind of interesting. All right. Anyway, the others saw that he was very bright in literature and said, oh, just don't waste your time in a monastery, because you're kind of a flake. And, you know, you forget when chapel is and things like that. But go and study. We'll pay for your education. And anywhere, go. That's either good or bad, I don't know. We'll pay for you to leave. So he goes. He goes to the University of Pittsburgh, which might not sound like much, but it had a fantastic literature program once upon a time, especially in poetry. He earns his doctorate. He begins teaching at John Carroll University, which is a Jesuit institution that has also produced many, many fine people, and at least their graduate English program, and writes poetry and teaches. He's nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry in 1965, 68, 73, 76, and 78. All of his poetry is out of print, but you can find it all over the place. He became the quintessential teacher of poetry. He loved his classes. He taught creatively. He was kind of a space cadet, but he made that work marvelously. One time I saw him, I should point out, I was his dog's body. I was his research assistant one time. He always called me Larry because the previous research assistant had been named Larry. So, you know, it was just easier for him if we were all Larry. I was hoping the one after me would be called Rob, but she was called Larry. Anyway, well, I went over to his house. He'd always forget something in his mailbox. And if you've ever been an educator, or just know an educator, your mailbox fills up with things like notices about your grades were due 2 days ago, or please be present at this sporting event, or professor, can my term paper be another 2 months late, or all that stuff. And I pick up the stuff, I go over to his house, and he'd either be walking around the backyard with the neighbor's dog, or he would have forgotten he had called me to ask me to bring in his mail, and I'd go over there and the house was locked. But I knew to go to the Chinese restaurant on the corner because he'd be sitting there. Oh, Larry, I forgot. Yeah, all the stuff that he was teaching one time. And he'd get these freshman kids who had got through high school by figuring out what the teachers wanted to hear and repeating it back to them, because that's how we get through high school. All of us, every generation was met. We had, you know, those one-room schoolhouse with the horn books doing the same thing. And he sang to them, what's the narrative voice in this poem? And they're all trying to figure out, watching, and they're struggling, looking down the floor. It's like when the bishop asks you what your mission statement is. Looking down, and he doesn't. And all of a sudden, and he's looking, and he looks like Walt Whitman's deranged brother, right? He was also, he was 6'5", so he's looming over. And he leans forward, and they're all kind of leaning back like, is the narrative voice Joey Bananas? and then, I remember the poem was Down by the Sally Gardens by Yeats. Not a well-known poem. But he says, imagine if this were a song by Eddie Foy. Nobody knew who Eddie Foy was, but it doesn't matter. And he starts singing it. He sets it to music there. Down by the Sally, and pretends he has a hat, and he starts dancing around the room. And you watch them suddenly transform to these high school kids who are everybody's, you know, shiniest penny into a collection of kids who are actually, okay, this is going to be all right. And if they answered something, which was rare in these days, if they answered something that was so completely off the beam, he understood, because he was completely off the beam. Because you're talking about a guy who grew up in working class Brooklyn, made it through the hell of Korea, found some sort of spiritual balance temporarily in a monastery, and became then a beloved professor of poetry, and cranked out student after student. Tim Russert, remember him? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tim Russert never loved poetry until he had Magner as his teacher. Oh. And he became quite a fan. I remember him once talking on that Imus show about how he always wanted to put together a volume of his favorite poems. Of course, he died of a heart attack.
Yeah.
Rather young, too, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway. So, and again, it's not so much him, but I think about him because I think of that whole generation who use spirituality and literature and teaching to sort of bring about their own healing, but also to add something to the greater conversation too. And again, out of spiritual impulse. He remained a devout Roman Catholic his whole life. And I always used to love looking at his graduate classes because you'd be half secularized, kind of schlumpy guys like me, and then the other half would be priests and nuns who came to learn from him and to expand their notion of spirituality beyond just scripture theology and what was taught, but into something greater. So that's one of the reasons sometimes in the late 20th century, Wagner and people like him, they have that intertwining of spirituality and literature that was so interesting. I always think about that. We spoke about Kerouac earlier. I mean, he actually has a book of, or he did, I wonder if it could still be found. He had a book of poems to the Blessed Virgin Mary and prayed to her every night, and St. Jerome. So,
Did
anyway.
Wagner's poems rhyme?
Sometimes. Depending on his mood. I've got a book. I was going to write down. I don't think I did I? I was going to write one down. They're actually pretty good. They're pretty accessible. Some rhyme, some don't. There's one called On a Street Called Straight, which is about, you recognize that from Scripture, I think, which is all about sort of perceiving that things have changed. And he works in biblical verses that you don't realize are biblical verses into his own verse, until as you read it. It's all this kind of wonderfully smoothed out, interesting passage. I didn't want to bring tedious poetry to you because,
Doesn't rhyme.
it's 20th century poetry,
I know. Well,
All right. That's what we have tonight. Everyone, our four tonight. Next week, the final four. The only final four that everyone will see this year. Yeah, that's it. That's it from the finals. No NCAA, nothing. I can't remember who it is, except there will be, somebody interesting. Oh, yeah. One person particularly. I don't know whether to begin with him or end with him. But I'll simply say it this way. He saved more lives than anybody else in the history of the human race.
wow.
And because he was a devout Lutheran. So, all right, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Lord, give us the grace we need to conclude our day, to enable us to reach our journey's end in safety, and to realize somewhere in the heart of us all, as faithful people, we bear our own stories and take virtue from our own experiences to help transform the world in ways small and large, knowing with great faith and absolute understanding that there's at least one person in the world whose life is better because we share the word with him. And all this we do for the sake of Jesus Christ our Lord. The blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon you and remain with you always. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, for the
Yes.
soon.
Yes.